I'll buy this entire restaurant just to fire you. Unless you can serve me in Chinese, Richard Whitmore said, his voice smooth, amused, and just loud enough to make sure every head in the room turned toward her as the clink of silverware faded into a sharp, unnatural silence that seemed to stretch across the polished marble floor and climb the glass walls of the high-rise dining room overlooking the city lights 30 stories below. And Ava Johnson stood there in her simple black uniform, a tray balanced lightly in her hand, her name tag catching a sliver of warm chandelier light, as if it were the only thing in the room still allowed to shine while the rest of her was expected to disappear. And somewhere behind Richard, a man let out a quiet chuckle, followed by another, until the sound spread like a ripple through the table of tailored suits and expensive watches. The kind of laughter that didn't need permission because it assumed it already owned the room, and Ava felt it. Not just the laughter, but the weight of it, the assumption behind it, the quiet agreement that she was small, that she was temporary, that she was someone you could test, someone you could reduce to a moment of entertainment between courses. And her fingers tightened just slightly around the edge of the tray before relaxing again, her breath steady, controlled, the faint hum of the city outside mixing with the low buzz of conversation that hadn't quite returned yet, because everyone was waiting, watching, curious how this would end, whether she would laugh it off, walk away, or stumble under the pressure of a man who had built an empire on getting exactly what he wanted. And Richard leaned back in his chair, one arm draped casually over the leather, his expression calm, almost bored, like he had already decided the outcome before the moment even began, while Ava's eyes moved briefly across the table, taking in the details. The untouched glasses of sparkling water, the folded linen, napkins, the reflections of faces that didn't expect to be challenged, and then back to him, her posture straight, her voice still silent, but something in the air had shifted, something subtle, like the moment before a storm when the wind pauses just long enough to make you wonder if you imagined it, and if this moment already has your heart racing. If you've ever seen someone underestimated just because of who they are or where they stand, take a second right now to hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss what happens next, and tell me in the comments, what time is it where you're watching from, and what city or country are you in, because stories like this travel far, and tonight, in this room, something is about to happen that no one here is ready for, not even the man who thinks he's in control. 8 hours earlier, the city had still been gray and quiet, the kind of early morning where the sidewalks were damp from a light drizzle and the neon signs had not yet surrendered to daylight. And Ava Johnson had stepped off a bus 2 blocks from the restaurant, her shoes worn but clean, her coat pulled tight against the chill as she walked past storefronts that had not opened yet, her reflection briefly appearing in the dark glass before fading as she moved on, because she never lingered long enough to look at herself. Not anymore. And inside the restaurant the lights had been softer then, not the golden glow of evening but a pale, working light that revealed everything, every fingerprint on the glass, every smudge on the polished wood, every detail that had to be erased before the world arrived. And Ava moved through it all with quiet precision, her hands steady, her movements efficient, like someone who understood that excellence was not optional when you were expected to be invisible. And no one noticed the way she paused for half a second near a table where a foreign newspaper had been left behind, her eyes scanning a headline in a language most people in the room would not recognize, her lips pressing together slightly before she set it aside and kept working, because moments like that belonged to her alone and there was no space here for them. Not in a place where people like her were seen as part of the background, not the story, and by noon the restaurant had transformed, the scent of fresh bread replacing the faint smell of cleaning solution, the low murmur of early diners building into a steady rhythm of conversation and clinking glasses, and Ava had slipped into her role completely, her posture calm, her voice soft but clear, her smile measured, never too much, never too little, just enough to make people comfortable without making them curious. Because curiosity led to questions, and questions led to attention, and attention was something she had learned to avoid, not because she lacked anything to show, but because she knew how quickly the world could decide it did not matter, and her manager had once told her, not unkindly, but not gently either, that consistency was her strength, that guests liked knowing what to expect, and Ava had nodded, understanding the message beneath the words. that she was not here to stand out. She was here to serve, to move quietly between tables, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to make sure the experience remained seamless for those who believed they deserved it. And yet there were small moments, almost invisible, where something else surfaced, like when a couple from out of town struggled to read the menu and she guided them effortlessly, her pronunciation precise, her tone respectful, or when a businessman made an offhand comment in another language and she responded just enough to clarify his order without drawing attention to the fact that she had understood every word. And each time, she stepped back into the quiet rhythm of her work as if nothing had happened, as if the part of her that could have filled the room had chosen instead to fold itself neatly into the space allowed to it. And now, standing under the warm evening lights with the entire restaurant watching, that same quiet discipline held her steady, her shoulders relaxed, her gaze level, her breath even, because this was not the first time she had been underestimated, and it would not be the last. But something about this moment felt different, not louder, not harsher, just clearer, like a line had been drawn in a place no one else could see yet. And for the first time that day, Ava did not look away. Richard Whitmore had always been a man who controlled the room before he even spoke, and tonight was no different. The low glow of the chandelier reflecting off the rim of his glass as he swirled at once, slow and deliberate, while the men and women seated around him leaned in just slightly, not because they needed to hear him, but because they were used to orbiting his presence, and the table itself felt less like a place to dine and more like a quiet extension of his authority, every detail curated, every movement measured. And yet there was a subtle shift now, something almost imperceptible, as his gaze remained fixed on Ava, studying her in a way that suggested he had expected hesitation, maybe a nervous laugh, maybe an apology, something that would restore the balance he was accustomed to. But it had not come, and that absence lingered longer than it should have, stretching the moment thin. And one of the investors, a man in his late 50s with silver hair and a polished accent, leaned back with a faint smile that did not quite reach his eyes, as if he were entertained but also curious how far this would go, while another reached for his phone, not openly, just enough to tilt it toward the scene, capturing what he likely assumed would be a brief spectacle. And near the edge of the room, the manager stood still, hands clasped tightly in front of him, his expression caught somewhere between concern and calculation, because moments like this could tip in either direction, and he knew it, even if he did not say it. And the waitstaff nearby slowed their movements without stopping completely, trays still in hand, steps quieter, eyes flickering just long enough to take in the tension before looking away again, because this was not their moment, not their place. And yet they felt it too, the way the air had changed, the way the usual rhythm of the restaurant had been interrupted by something sharper, something that demanded attention. And Richard finally set his glass down with a soft, precise sound, his fingers resting briefly on the table as he leaned forward just slightly, his voice lower now, more focused, less performative but no less controlled, as if he were narrowing the frame of the moment to just the two of them. And there was a confidence in him that had been built over decades, reinforced by deals closed, rooms won, people who had learned quickly not to challenge him, and he had no reason to believe this would be any different, because from his perspective, this was simple, a test, a game, a way to assert the natural order he believed in, where someone like him asked and someone like her responded. And the outcome was already understood, and yet as he watched Ava stand there, unmoving, composed, something did not align with that expectation, not in any obvious way, not in a way he could immediately name, but enough to make him pause for a fraction of a second longer than usual. And in that fraction, the room held its breath, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the quiet way that signals something is about to shift, even if no one has admitted it yet. The silence did not break all at once. It thinned, stretched, then settled again as Ava lowered the tray onto the edge of a nearby service stand with a soft, controlled motion, the faint clink of porcelain against metal sounding louder than it should have in a room filled with people. And for a brief second her fingers rested there, steady, grounded, before she let go and turned fully toward the table, her shoulders square, her posture unchanged, not defiant, not submissive, simply present in a way that did not ask for permission. And Richard watched closely now, no longer amused in the same easy way, his eyes narrowing just slightly, as if trying to recalibrate something that no longer fit his expectations. While across from him one of the investors leaned forward with interest, the corner of his mouth lifting as though he sensed a shift but could not yet define it. And the manager near the wall took a half step forward before stopping himself, uncertain whether to intervene or wait, because the moment had moved beyond routine and into something unpredictable. And Ava inhaled slowly, the air cool against her lungs, the scent of roasted meat and citrus lingering faintly around her, grounding her in the physical reality of the space even as the attention of the room pressed in from all sides. And when she spoke, it was not rushed, not hesitant, but measured and clear, her voice carrying just enough to reach every corner of the table without rising above it, the tones precise, fluid, unmistakably natural as she responded in Mandarin, not a rehearsed phrase, not a simple greeting, but a full, composed sentence that flowed effortlessly into the next, her pronunciation crisp, her cadence confident, the kind of fluency that could not be borrowed or memorized overnight. And for a moment no one reacted, because the expectation had been something smaller, something easier to dismiss. And what they heard instead did not match that expectation at all, and a faint crease appeared between Richard's brows, not dramatic, not obvious, but enough to suggest that the script in his mind had just been interrupted, and someone at the far end of the table let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but it stopped halfway, caught between disbelief and recognition, and Ava did not pause. She did not look away. She simply continued, her tone shifting slightly as she clarified the menu options, describing the preparation of each dish in a way that was both professional and precise, as if this had always been part of her role, as if there had never been a question about whether she could do it. And the room adjusted around her, not loudly, not suddenly, but in subtle ways, shoulders straightening, expressions sharpening, the casual amusement fading into something more attentive, more uncertain, and Richard's fingers, which had rested loosely on the table before, now stilled completely, his gaze fixed on her with a focus that was no longer casual, no longer dismissive, but searching, as if he were trying to understand how something he had reduced to a challenge had just become something he could not immediately control. And when Ava finished the final sentence, her voice softened slightly at the end, not as a retreat, but as a natural conclusion. And then she fell silent again, the quiet returning to the room like a held breath finally released. But this time it felt different, heavier, charged with a realization that had not fully surfaced yet, but was already impossible to ignore. For a brief moment, no one spoke, and then the reaction came in fragments, not as a single burst, but as scattered responses trying to catch up with what had just happened. A soft murmur from the far end of the table, a chair shifting slightly, the faint tap of a glass being set down a little too quickly, and one of the younger executives let out a quiet, uncertain laugh as if searching for something familiar to hold on to. But it faded almost immediately when no one else joined in, and Richard's expression remained still, his eyes fixed on Ava with a focus that had sharpened into something more deliberate, more calculating, as though he were reassessing not just her, but the entire moment. And he leaned back slowly, exhaling through his nose, the confidence still there, but no longer effortless, no longer unquestioned. And when he spoke again, his tone carried a different edge, less amused, more probing, as if he needed to regain control of the narrative that had slipped just slightly out of his grasp. And he said something in Mandarin, faster this time, more complex, the kind of phrasing designed to test nuance rather than surface understanding. And few people at the table exchanged glances, sensing the shift, sensing that this was no longer a simple exchange, but something closer to a challenge that had escalated beyond its original intent. And Ava listened without interrupting, her head tilting just slightly, her expression unchanged, absorbing the rhythm, the tone, the intention behind the words. And when he finished, there was a brief pause, just long enough for the weight of the question to settle, and then she answered, just as fluidly, her response precise, measured, not only matching his pace but clarifying a subtle misinterpretation in what he had said, adjusting a phrase, refining a meaning, the kind of correction that did not embarrass but could not be ignored either. And this time the reaction was different, quieter but deeper, a stillness that carried recognition rather than curiosity, and the man with the silver hair straightened in his seat, his brows lifting slightly as if something had clicked into place. While another executive lowered his phone, no longer recording, his attention fully on her now, and near the wall, the manager's posture shifted, his concern easing into something closer to disbelief, as if he were seeing someone he thought he knew for the first time, and Richard's fingers tightened just slightly against the edge of the table before relaxing again, his gaze not leaving Ava's face, and for a fraction of a second, something unguarded flickered there, not doubt exactly, but the realization that the rules of the moment had changed, that the simple hierarchy he had relied on was no longer holding the way it should, and Ava remained where she was, steady, composed, her hands resting lightly at her sides, not claiming the moment, not retreating from it, simply holding her place within it with a quiet certainty that did not ask to be acknowledged, and the room, once so quick to follow. Richard's lead now hovered in a different kind of silence, one that did not belong to him alone anymore. The room did not erupt, it softened, as if something invisible had been placed gently at the center of it and no one wanted to disturb it, the earlier tension dissolving into a quieter, heavier stillness where even the smallest sounds seemed to carry meaning, the faint hum of the air conditioning, the distant clink of dishes from the kitchen, the slow exhale of someone who had not realized they were holding their breath. And Ava stood there in that stillness, not moving forward, not stepping back, her presence grounded in a calm that did not demand attention yet held it completely, the light above her catching the edge of her cheek and the subtle texture of her uniform, turning something ordinary into something almost deliberate. And for the first time that evening, no one was looking at her as part of the service, they were looking at her as the moment itself, and she felt it, not as pressure, but as clarity, the kind that comes when the noise fades and all that remains is the truth of where you stand. And her heartbeat, steady and quiet, matched the rhythm of her breathing, each inhale measured, each exhale releasing the weight of everything that had been placed on her without words, and somewhere in the room a glass was lifted and set back down again without a sip, the gesture unfinished, as if even habit had paused to watch, and Richard remained still, his posture unchanged, but his focus sharpened in a way that no longer sought to control, only to understand, his eyes tracing the space between them as though recalculating something deeper than the exchange itself, and the others around the table mirrored that shift in their own ways, a slight lean forward, a hand resting flat against the table instead of fidgeting, a gaze that no longer flickered away but stayed, attentive, present, and the manager by the wall lowered his hands, the tension in his shoulders easing into something quieter, almost reflective, as if he were witnessing a version of the room he had never considered possible, and Ava's fingers brushed lightly against the edge of the service stand, not gripping, just touching, a small physical anchor that kept her connected to the moment without being consumed by it. And in that touch there was no hesitation, only awareness, the awareness of someone who had spent years navigating spaces that did not expect her to speak, and had learned when to remain silent and when to step forward, and now she simply stood, her gaze steady, her expression calm, allowing the silence to exist without rushing to fill it, because she did not need to prove anything further. The truth had already been spoken, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly enough that it could not be undone, and the room, once shaped by assumption, now rested in something else entirely, something quieter, something more honest, where the balance had shifted not through force, but through presence alone. It was not Ava who broke the silence. It was a voice from halfway down the table, quieter than the others but carrying a weight that shifted everything, and the silver-haired investor leaned forward, his eyes no longer curious but intent, as if he had been searching his memory for something that had finally surfaced, and he spoke slowly, almost to himself at first, before the words reached the rest of the room, saying that he had heard that voice before, not here, not in this setting, but somewhere else, somewhere that mattered. And the room turned toward him without realizing it, pulled by the gravity of recognition rather than authority, and Ava did not react outwardly. But there was the faintest stillness in her shoulders, a pause that suggested she understood exactly where this was going, and the man continued, now more certain, describing a closed-door negotiation in Tokyo nearly a year ago, a deal that had nearly collapsed over a mistranslation buried deep within a multi $1 million contract. Something subtle, something dangerous, the kind of detail that could cost a company everything if overlooked. And he glanced at Richard then, not accusing, not dramatic, just direct, reminding him of the night his team had received an anonymous correction, a revised clause sent through an internal channel with no name attached, written in precise, flawless language that had saved the agreement from unraveling before it even began. And for a moment Richard did not respond, his gaze fixed on the table as if replaying the memory in real time, the late-night call, the urgency, the quiet relief when the issue had been resolved without explanation, and the investor's voice softened slightly as he finished, saying that the phrasing, the cadence, the clarity of what Ava had just spoken felt exactly the same, not similar, not close, but exact, and that was when the shift became undeniable, not loud, not explosive, but absolute, like a door opening in a room no one realized was closed. And Richard looked up slowly, his expression no longer guarded in the same way, something deeper moving beneath the surface, something closer to recognition than control, and his eyes met Ava's again. But this time there was no challenge in them, no assumption, only a question that did not need to be spoken, and Ava held his gaze without hesitation, not confirming, not denying, simply allowing the truth to exist in the space between them without dressing it in explanation. And around them the table had gone completely still, every earlier trace of amusement gone, replaced by something quieter, something more careful, as if each person present understood that they were no longer witnessing a moment of entertainment, but the unraveling of a misunderstanding they had all participated in. And the balance of the room, once so firmly anchored in status and assumption, had shifted entirely, not through force, not through confrontation, but through something far more difficult to dismiss, the quiet, undeniable presence of truth. No one spoke immediately, because the weight of what had just surfaced did not invite quick reactions. It demanded stillness, and Richard remained seated for a moment longer than anyone expected, his hand resting flat against the table, fingers no longer tapping, no longer signaling control, just still, as if grounding himself in a reality that had shifted beneath him without warning. And then, slowly, he stood, not abruptly, not with authority, but with a measured movement that carried something unfamiliar, something quieter, and the subtle scrape of his chair against the floor echoed softly through the room, drawing every eye back to him, not out of habit this time, but out of anticipation, because whatever he did next would define the moment in a way no one else could. And he looked at Ava again, really looked this time, not at her uniform, not at her role, but at her, and there was a pause, a fraction of a second where the man who had built his life on certainty seemed to choose his words more carefully than he ever had in this room. And when he spoke, his voice was lower, stripped of its earlier edge, carrying a clarity that did not need volume to be heard. And he said that he remembered that night, that he remembered the message, the correction that had come without a name, and that he had trusted it without knowing why. And the admission hung there, simple, unembellished, but heavier than anything he had said before. And he took a small step forward, closing a distance that had not been physical until now, and he added that he had been wrong, not just in the moment, but in the assumption behind it. And the words did not come easily, that much was clear, but they came honestly. And in that honesty there was no performance, no attempt to regain control, only an acknowledgement that something real had been revealed. And the room shifted again, not with surprise this time, but with a quiet recognition of what it meant for someone like him to say that out loud. And Ava listened, without interrupting, her expression steady, her posture unchanged, not accepting, not rejecting, simply present in the moment as it unfolded. And when he finished, there was no immediate response from her, no need to fill the space he had opened. And after a second, she gave a small nod, not as validation, not as forgiveness offered dramatically, but as a simple acknowledgement that she had heard him, and that was enough. And Richard's shoulders eased slightly, not in relief, but in understanding, as if he realized that whatever this moment was, it did not belong to him anymore. It did not need to be resolved on his terms. And around them, the others at the table sat quieter than before, their earlier confidence replaced by a more careful awareness, as if they were seeing the structure of the room differently now. and the manager near the wall exhaled slowly, his posture relaxing in a way that suggested he had been holding tension he could not name until it was gone. And Ava reached once more for the tray she had set aside earlier, lifting it with the same steady hands, the same quiet precision, as if returning to her work was not a retreat, but a choice, a continuation of who she had always been. And without another word, she turned slightly, ready to move, leaving behind a silence that no longer belonged to power, but to something far more enduring. The moment did not end with applause or noise. It settled into something quieter, something that lingered long after Ava turned away from the table and stepped back into the rhythm of the restaurant. Her movements the same as before, measured, steady, her tray balanced with effortless control as she approached another table, asked a question, refilled a glass, each action precise and calm as if nothing extraordinary had happened. And yet everything had changed, not in the room itself, not in the arrangement of chairs or the glow of the lights, but in the way people saw, in the way they paused just a little longer when she passed, in the way their voices softened without realizing it. And behind her, Richard remained standing for a moment before slowly taking his seat again, not with the same certainty as before, but with a quiet awareness that something within him had shifted, something he could not undo. And he did not call her back. He did not try to reclaim the moment, because he understood now that it was never his to control in the first place. And the conversation at the table resumed, but it carried a different tone, less performative, more grounded, as if each person present had been reminded of something they had forgotten, something simple but easy to overlook, that value does not announce itself, and dignity does not require permission. And across the room, Ava paused briefly near the window, the city lights stretching out beyond the glass in endless lines of gold and white, reflections flickering softly across her face, and for a second, just one, she allowed herself to breathe a little deeper, not in relief, not in triumph, but in quiet recognition of the moment that had passed. And then she moved again, back into her work, back into the flow, because that was who she was, not defined by a single moment, but consistent in all of them. And the restaurant carried on, the hum of voices rising again, the rhythm restored, but underneath it, something remained, something subtle and lasting, like a note that continues to echo long after the sound itself has faded. And if this moment stayed with you, if you felt that shift, that quiet reminder of what real strength looks like, take a second to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you do not miss the next story that speaks to the same truth. Because sometimes the most powerful moments are the ones that do not demand attention. They simply reveal it. And tonight, in a room full of certainty, it was not power that defined the ending, it was presence. In the next video, I will talk about the story, Billionaire insulted the black waitress as stupid. Seconds later, she replied in perfect Arabic. See you in the next video. Thank you for watching.